William Browder is Vladimir Putin's #1 foreign enemy and CEO of the Hermitage Capital Fund. Welcome to our program, Mr. Browder.
Great to be here.
Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has declared another ceasefire for 3 days from May 8 to May 11, based on humanitarian consideration. How do you see the main reasons behind this another 3-day ceasefire from Vladimir Putin?
Well, first of all, when Vladimir Putin declares a ceasefire, it's a meaningless statement. He doesn't cease fire. For example, his 24-hour ceasefire a week ago, he didn't cease firing. So I think we have to completely ignore the fact that he's declaring a ceasefire because it's not for real. But why is he declaring it? Well, I think that he's in a slightly awkward place right now because Donald Trump has staked a lot of his personal capital and reputation on ending the war. If you remember, he had a campaign slogan that he was going to end the war in 24 hours. Of course, that didn't happen. Then he talked about ending the war in 100 days. That hasn't happened. But Donald Trump has got a very strong motivation to end the war. And if Vladimir Putin completely ignores that, that might make the sort of warming relations between Trump and Putin a little less warm. And so I think Putin is kind of throwing this out there as a way of trying to buy himself some more time, keep his relations good with Donald Trump, and then hope that Trump then starts focusing again on President Zelensky instead of on Putin.
But do you believe that Putin would be able to do so for a while by only declaring ceasefires for 1 or 2 days? Do you feel that Trump will buy this in long-term perspective?
Well, part of the problem is that Trump seems to have an affinity for Vladimir Putin. He wants to be friends with Vladimir Putin. He wants to give Vladimir Putin the benefit of the doubt. And he wants to do business with Vladimir Putin. And so I think he's looking for any type of positive signals so he can say, look, everything is going in my direction. I mean, we have to sort of put aside what's really going on here, because what's really going on here is that Trump has sided with Putin and he's sided against Ukraine. I mean, that's what's really going on here. But if we look at all these, so what I would call this is almost a game of kabuki theater, where Trump says he's going to be tough on Putin. Putin then declares some fake ceasefire, and everything goes back to normal for a little while.
Also, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin told Steve Witkoff that he was ready to halt invasion of Ukraine, according to Financial Times sources. Do you believe in that?
No, I don't believe that. And in fact, after he said that, we saw his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, make an announcement of the conditions that they would need to end the war. And the conditions are the same conditions that they put on to start the war. This, quote, denazification of Ukraine, demilitarization of Ukraine, full control over the 5 territories that they have seized, and even much of the territory that they haven't seized, and so on and so forth. And so I think that we're exactly where we were before. Russia is not adjusting their position. Russia is having a maximalist approach towards this war. And in my opinion, the only way that this war is going to end is if Ukraine is given the weapons it needs to put Russia in a untenable position. And that has to be the priority right now for the West.
Also, US President Donald Trump met privately with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Italy, in Vatican. After this meeting between Trump and Zelensky, Trump for the first time questioned whether Putin really wants a peace deal, a ceasefire. Quote, "It makes me think that maybe Putin doesn't want to stop the war, he is just taking me along." how can you assess the results of this meeting between Trump and Zelensky in Vatican and the possibility of Donald Trump turning against Putin sometime in the future, for example?
Well, considering where we were before that meeting in the Vatican, I think it's definitely an improvement. Of course, we were on a very fast deterioration situation where a week before, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, basically announced that he was going to wash his hands of Ukraine and wash his hands of the whole issue. And so the fact that President Zelensky had an opportunity to meet with President Trump, and they had that what looked like a very symbolic meeting, and the result of that was some words of criticism from Trump against Putin, is a much better place than we were a week before. Having said that, I wouldn't bank on the fact that Trump is all of a sudden going to change his position towards Putin. As we've seen, Trump has been fairly consistent over a long period of time that he admires Putin, that he wants to be friends with Putin, he wants to do business with Putin. And I don't think that that's changed. And so I wouldn't get too hopeful about these noises that he's made, but it's certainly a lot better than it was a few days before that meeting.
Let's also cover U.S. proposal on a ceasefire deal in Ukraine. According to Axios, U.S. is ready to recognize Crimea as a Russian territory, de jure and also de facto recognize Russian control over occupied Ukrainian land. How do you assess this offer from Trump's administration, and would it be a fair deal for Ukraine, for international law?
No, it's a terrible deal for Ukraine. Ukraine shouldn't accept it. I don't think Ukraine can accept it. I don't think that President Zelensky has the legal opportunity to accept it, even if he wanted to, and he shouldn't. Moreover, I don't think that Europe thinks that this is a fair deal. And the main problem with this is that it basically rewards Putin for his war of aggression. It doesn't create any justice for all the damage done to Ukraine, for all the people killed. And I think that it's unacceptable by any measure, this proposed deal.
And do you feel that the US is giving Vladimir Putin too much in these talks?
The United States is giving Putin everything. It's basically saying everything that you've accomplished so far, you get to keep. There's no consequence. Sanctions will be lifted. You get Crimea officially recognized. It's a disaster. It shouldn't be even contemplated for a second.
On the other hand, according to Bloomberg, the US will demand that Russia accept Ukraine's right to have its own army and defense industry as a part of a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. Do you see this as at least a good sign from Trump's administration that they will demand from Putin accept Ukraine's right to have proper armed forces?
Putin shouldn't be in a position to determine whether Ukraine has armed forces or not. Ukraine is an independent sovereign state that can determine the size and ability of its armed forces like any other country in the world. It's not for Putin to decide. It's a complete nonsense that Putin has any say in the matter. So I think that we shouldn't be celebrating what's the natural right of any sovereign state to have.
How do you see the possibility the United States government walking away from ceasefire talks? Because recently US Vice President J.D. Vance said that his administration would walk away from ceasefire negotiations unless Ukraine and Russia agree on a ceasefire deal. Do you see this as a good or bad scenario for Ukraine? Because some analysts believe that in such case, Europe will lead negotiations with Vladimir Putin, and as a result of that, Putin would be in more difficult position.
Well, so we need to sort of zero down what that threat really is. And what the threat really is the U.S. will stop supplying arms to Ukraine and stop supplying military intelligence to Ukraine. Do I think that that's likely? I think it's likely. I think there's a reasonable probability, maybe even more likely than not that the US does that. If that happens, then of course there's all sorts of very negative physical consequences to Ukraine, because the weapons that the US has supplied have been very helpful in the military defense of Ukraine. US supplies 40% of defensive weapons to Ukraine, European Union 60%. And if the US drops out, that means the Europeans have to pick up the slack. Will the Europeans pick up the slack? Maybe. I don't know for sure. I think that there's a possibility that the Europeans at that point will decide that instead of digging into their own pockets, they should confiscate the frozen $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. If it happened, then from a resource money perspective, Ukraine would probably be in the same position they were before the US pulled out. But it doesn't solve the problem that the US supplies certain types of weapons that are unavailable anywhere else, like the Patriot missile defense system, which shoots down incoming missiles from Russia. There's no way to replace the intelligence that comes from US spy satellites that are constantly hovering above the territory and such things like that. And so I think that if US were to withdraw from military aid for Ukraine, Ukraine would still be able to survive, but I think that there would be a lot more damage, a lot more death, and it would be far preferable if the US stayed as an ally and stayed as a supporter of Ukraine.
Let's cover also a situation inside Russia and Vladimir Putin's inner circle. Recently, Russian General Yaroslav Khalik, who was a senior military officer in Russia's general staff, has been killed in car bomb attack. Kremlin blames Ukraine for this attack. How can you assess the psychological consequences of this attack, and what does it mean for Vladimir Putin, and what does it mean? What does such attack mean in the middle of negotiations?
Well, Russia has been launching every night attacks on Ukrainian civilians, killing women, children, men, destroying property of innocent Ukrainian civilians. And so if a military person who was involved in killing those civilians is all of a sudden killed, it seems that all is fair in war, and it's certainly not something that anybody can get upset about. It's also important to point out that if Ukraine really was involved in this, and I don't have any information one way or another, but it should, if Ukraine was, then it should put the fear into the hearts of other generals and other officials in Russia that they could potentially be killed as well if they're involved in terrible atrocities in Ukraine. And so it's not just a one-sided thing. It can't be that Ukraine suffers casualties of civilians and that everyone in Russia can sit there feeling safe and immune from consequences.
From your perspective, do you believe that there are at least some people around Putin who are trying to persuade him to agree with ceasefire proposal, to have has deal?
I don't think there's anybody in Russia that is trying to contain Putin. I think Putin is got his own mind, he makes his own decisions, and that anybody who has any different opinion than him doesn't express it out of fear. Everybody is terrified of Vladimir Putin. And so the only person who can put pressure on Putin, if he wanted to, is the President of the United States, Donald Trump. So far, other than a few words, I haven't seen any evidence that he's ready to put pressure on Putin to end the war.
You just mentioned about Trump. US President Trump has been threatening to impose tariffs and sanctions on Russian goods, secondary tariffs. How can you assess the effectiveness of such a decision if it is being imposed by US administration? I mean, sanctions, tariffs, and also additional secondary tariffs on Russian oil and gas on those countries who are buying Russian oil and gas.
So the United States, if they wanted to, could completely decapitate Russia economically. The United States has the capacity to ruin Russia. And so if that decision was taken, and it was taken in a way, in a smart way, things could go very badly for Putin. And what I mean by that is that the one remaining unsanctioned part of the economy is oil. Russia continues to export oil. If the United States of America decided to tell countries that if they buy Russian oil, then they will be sanctioned, they won't buy Russian oil. If Russia can't sell its oil, then Putin will not have money to fund his war, and he'll be then forced into a proper negotiating situation where he has to give stuff up. But at the moment, Trump has not done that.
However, such big countries like China, India, and other big actors in this game, they're buying Russian oil and gas. Do you believe that the US government has enough leverage to force these countries to stop, to hold buying Russian oil and gas by imposing these sanctions? Would it be enough to prevent them from buying Russian oil and gas?
Absolutely, it would. If the United States said to an Indian oil refinery that if you buy Russian oil, then we will impose sanctions on you, so that and we will impose sanctions on anyone who does business with you, I guarantee you, the next minute, the Indian oil refinery will stop buying Russian oil. It's a certainty.
So they would not have any other choice but to stop buying Russian oil and gas due to sanctions.
That's correct.
And also, recently, US President Donald Trump said that he has been putting pressure also on Russia. However, there is a big discussion in the Trump administration about doing business with Russia after ceasefire deal between Ukraine and Russia. What is your personal message to American businessmen who are considering right now the possibility of doing business with Russia and in Russia?
Well, I don't think that there's seriously many people considering doing business in Russia. Even before this war started, it was a toxic business environment full of unbelievable corruption, violence, expropriation, and other nastiness. And I know all about that because I'm the poster child of what goes wrong if you're an investor in Russia. I was the largest foreign investor in Russia. I was expelled from the country. My offices were raided. They seized our documents, and then the documents were used to steal our companies and steal $230 million of taxes that we paid to the Russian government. My lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, exposed the crime, and he was subsequently arrested, tortured for 358 days, and killed in Russian police custody. And so what I tell anybody who's considering investing in Russia is that you don't just risk losing your money, you also risk losing your life.
And also, there is a big public discussion and also inner discussion in the White House about lifting sanctions against Russian economy. On the other hand, European allies propose to lift sanctions against Russia only in case of full ceasefire deal and only at different stages, not just lifting all sanctions in one moment, but creating several stages during which sanctions should be lifted. And also, big question remains what should be and what would be with Russian frozen money in Europe. Do you believe that European countries would be happy to also, for example, allow Russia to buy Boeing planes using Russia's frozen assets, even if Donald Trump negotiates and if he reaches such deal with Vladimir Putin?
No, it's totally unacceptable. Russia has done $500 billion of damage to Ukraine. Russia needs to pay for it. And so it's obvious that the frozen Russian assets should be used either for the defense of Ukraine, if this war carries on, or for the reconstruction of Ukraine, if the war ends. but under no circumstances should that money be used to buy Boeing airplanes. And on top of that, there's a whole bunch of Boeing airplanes that the Russians confiscated from a bunch of Western leasing companies. And so before anyone even talks about buying more Russian Boeing planes, Russia should be returning those planes that they stole.
Let's also cover Donald Trump's tariffs and its influence on the global economy. How do you see the influence of this global trade war between the US and China? And do you believe that this decision was right to impose tariffs, then to change, to recalculate the main effectiveness and the main consequences of this decision? It seems like Donald Trump has changed his mind and made some exemptions from, for example, electronic goods from China shipping to US. What is your take on the current stage of global trade war between the US and China?
Well, I think it's a total disaster for the US economy, for the US consumer, and also for the Chinese and for others as well. I mean, this is probably the single largest self-inflicted economic wound that anyone could ever have thought of. It's terrible. But there is one silver lining, which is that it's pushed the price of oil down. And as Russia's main commodity export is oil, these tariffs and all this consequence of these tariffs at least put Putin in a more tenuous position.
You just mentioned about the Russian oil. What kind of price for Russian oil would really decapitate Putin's economy, will destroy his regime?
I think if you have the price of oil in the low 40s, that's it. Putin's finished. 50s is hard. Where it is right now, it's not good. He really needs a lot higher oil prices to survive.
But don't you think that Russia has also another currency reserves inside Russia?
Russia is a very rich country because of all the money that's been accumulated over a period of time. And so Russia's not a heavily indebted country. There's not a lot of interest payments to make. And so we've seen lots of much worse countries economically survive for a very long time. And so I wouldn't in any way predict that Russia stops functioning, but I can say that Russia can't borrow money from the West at the moment. And Russia, if there's no oil money coming in, it's going to become a lot tighter, and they're going to have to make a lot of compromises that they didn't have to make before. And those compromises would be helpful to Ukraine.
And do you believe that current economic situation in Russia try to also convince Vladimir Putin to at least stay in this game of negotiations, forces Putin to negotiate with Trump, to stay in this game, even if he doesn't want to stop the war?
I don't think anyone's forcing Putin to do anything. Putin makes his own decisions. He doesn't care about the effect it has on the economy. He doesn't care about the number of dead Russian soldiers. All he cares about is Vladimir Putin. He cares that he stays in power, which keeps him alive. That's his main objective. And I think that, all this stuff is not helpful to him, but at the end of the day, he's not going to go starving.
Thank you, Mr. Browder, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.